Chapter 5. The Concept of an Ultimate Decree. If tomorrow the word and idea of life were abolished from all languages and men forbidden to allude to life, it might have an effect on speech, but it would not alter life and reality in the slightest. Men would, by other terms, continue to speak of life and to live it. Similarly, the general distaste for the word and idea of predestination no more affects reality than the abolition of life. The idea of predestination is an inescapable concept. It is the premise of all human thinking, a logical concomitant to thinking. The universe moves in terms of God's eternal decree, and man, created in God's image, thinks inevitably in terms of the purpose, pattern, and decree which predestination gives to all creation and to the functions of human thought. When man denies the divine predestination, he denies God's eternal decree, only to replace it with another decree. With the Enlightenment, men rebelled against the sovereign and triune God, and while retaining him formally as creator or first cause, replaced him in essence with the concept of nature. Nature became the source of law, and natural law replaced revelation as the norm for religion and society. An eternal decree was ascribed to nature, whereby all things had a totality of meaning which made this the best of all possible worlds. Pope gave poetical expression to this faith. All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance, direction which thou canst not see, all discord, harmony not understood, a partial evil, universal good. And spite of pride and erring reason's spite, one truth is clear: whatever is right. To make nature the source of a valid eternal decree, it was necessary to abolish the fall from nature. After all, how could nature be the source of ultimate truth and final law if nature represented only a fallen and sin-ridden order? Thus, a second aspect of the decree appears. First, the concept of predestination is a basic aspect of whatever is ultimate in any system. And second, inerrancy is a logical concomitant of ultimacy. What is ultimate is simply ultimate. There is no other truth, like it or not, and since the ultimate can only and always be true to itself, it is inerrant and infallible. Whatever becomes ultimate in any system becomes inevitably inerrant and infallible, even though men prefer to avoid these terms because of their Christian connotations. When, however, nature was subjected to evolutionary theory, the concept of an infallible nature, natural law, and a divine decree within nature was shattered. Nature represented simply in Darwinism chance and natural selection. Darwin tried to read a decree into this operation, but the damage was done. Another locale for the divine decree was necessary. Nature was another dead god gone down the drain. In terms of the new perspective of evolution, truth and meaning do not exist in the universe. In other words, there is no decree inherent in the universe or behind the universe. Man is alone, an accident of being, in a cold and alien universe which is a product of the fortuitous concourse of atoms. In this situation, man feels that he must do two things to survive. First, he must renounce the luxury and insanity of assuming that a god or gods exist. He must face the universe of brute factuality coldly and starkly. Second, truth and meaning are purely human categories of thought. They are man's creations and must be imposed on the universe. Man must now control and guide evolution. He must use the universe and master himself as well. A decree is necessary, and it does not exist in or behind the universe. Man must therefore promulgate his own divine decree and impose it upon human society and upon all creation. The instruments of man's decree are science and the state. Brought together, they mean scientific socialism, a society planned by a scientific elite, social engineers and social scientists. The impact of Darwinism forced this necessity to locate a new source for ultimate law and decree on all the facets of Western thought amenable to the theory of evolution. Prior to Darwin, of course, social evolution was already a widely held premise of Western thought, especially among those under the influence of Hegel. 4 approaches to the crisis can be briefly cited. First, the Marxist approach very quickly manifested its contempt of truth and meaning. Marx and Engels noted that communism was accused of denying, quote, eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion, all morality, and instead of continuing them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience, end quote. Marx and Engels, instead of denying this charge, simply declared that all such truths were simply reflections of material circumstances, that is, economically conditioned. Quote, the charges against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production has changed? The ruling class of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class, end quote. The one reality is, quote, process of eternal change, end quote, and even man's reason is invalid as it confronts this process. As a prominent Marxist has stated it, quote, thus dialectics teaches that at each instant in time and at each point in space something is born and evolves, something dissolves and disappears. What appears stable has already begun to die, and from its death life is born. It is an endless process of motion. This process of eternal change in things obeys rules which are not those of Aristotle's logic. Since Aristotle, the principle of contradiction has dominated the reasoning of philosophers, a thing, they said, cannot at the same time be and not be, but it can. Being contains its opposite within itself. It is itself transformed. That which appears unstable is destined to die under the influence of contrary forces. The present is explained by the past, in which it was already contained. One cannot understand it unless one knows whence it comes, end quote. Since truth is non-existent, the purpose of philosophy must not be meaning, but control. As Marx wrote, quote, 10. The standpoint of the old materialism is civil society. The standpoint of the new is human society or socialized humanity. 11. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, end quote. This scientific socialism is man's decree of predestination applied to history, to man and society, in order to give a human meaning to society. Man is thus sacrificed to the totalitarian state, to the scientific planners, as the only means of securing a decree and meaning in history. A second approach to the crisis has been that of American pragmatism, whose notable figures have been C.S. Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. C.S. Peirce defined pragmatism to say, in effect, that the meaning of any proposition is its logical or physical consequence. Quote, in order to ascertain the meaning of an intellectual conception, one should consider what practical consequences might conceivably result by necessity from the truth of that conception. And the sum of these consequences will constitute the entire meaning of the conception, end quote. Again, Peirce stated, quote, pragmatism is the principle that every theoretical judgment expressible in a sentence in the indicative mood is a confessed form of thought whose only meaning, if it has any, lies in its tendency to enforce a corresponding practical maxim expressible as a conditional sentence having its apodosis in the imperative mood, end quote. Quote-unquote truth, we might say, is thus whatever works. And William James, in pragmatism, in essence so defined it. Truth is thus functional or instrumental, not metaphysical. Metaphysics and religion, after Kant, belong to an earlier and more primitive phase of man's history. The concern of science is not with truth, but with method, and hence methodology is a major concern. The problem of science is thus discovering the best method of attaining that social order in which scientific planning, prediction, and control can be best used to organize man into a state most conducive to his welfare as it is scientifically determined. The new decree is thus a product of the scientific control of human society by means of science in the great society in order to produce the great community. Fabian socialism gives us a third approach to the crisis. Like the other strands in modern thought, it substitutes predestination by the sovereign socialist state for predestination by the sovereign and triune God. Fabianism retained in part the old liberal illusion that there could be a union of, quote, the greatest individual liberty, end quote, with, quote, common ownership, end quote, or socialism. Whereas Marxism broke with the ostensibly bourgeois concept of liberty, Fabianism, while equally socialistic, maintained that the old liberty would find its fulfillment in the new socialism, although this hope has come progressively to be more and more a cynical facade. Moreover, Fabianism, because of its radical relativism, felt it unnecessary to maintain the theoretical apparatus of Marxism. It therefore bypassed three basic ideas of Marxism. First, it dropped the materialistic or economic interpretation of history. No other concept was substituted because no theoretical framework was desired. The emphasis is on present planning and control. Second, the concept of the class struggle was dropped. And third, the surplus value theory was discarded. To be a Marxist requires some intensive study of Marx and Engels. To be a Fabian requires nothing more than a belief in scientific socialism. There is no body of thought to which one must subscribe. The Fabian position is an intellectual posture of cynicism for all modes of thinking, save those which reach Fabian conclusions, which approve, in brief, Fabian policies. As a result, Fabian socialism has had a great appeal for many people, including clergymen. It involves no intelligence, no identifying party membership, and no real responsibility for anything except a subscription to socialism. As a logically relativistic philosophy, it is in essence anti-intellectual and basically congenial to irrationalism in the name of science. A fourth approach to the crisis is neo-orthodoxy. Neo-orthodoxy is that form of existentialist philosophy which uses the concepts of Orthodox Christianity and of theology as the tools of an alien system, existentialism. Van Til has called attention to this aspect of Karl Barth's thinking, quote, in all this opposition to the idea of revelation as directly identical with history, Barth is doing, in effect, what Kierkegaard did when he argued that truth is in the subject. Barth tells us that a true approach to theology must be existential. A true existential approach is not possible on the basis of the idea of direct revelation. On the basis of objective or direct revelation, man is not really involved in the question of his relation to God. Quote, where the question is really that pertaining to man, there the subjective is the objective. End quote, end quote. Neo-orthodoxy, like Marxism, pragmatism, Fabianism, and existentialism, is a product of Kantianism, and for Kant, man is the ultimate source of law, and hence of the only decree and determination possible in history. All these and other modern systems are developments of Kantianism, and they agree, first, in denying God's revelation and his eternal decree. Second, they reject the 18th century concepts of a decree within nature. Third, they agree in insisting on man's decree as the necessary decree in order to establish meaning in history. Fourth, they are thus all totalitarian and socialistic, closer to one another than to Christianity, against which they are uniformly hostile. Fifth, Political liberalism logically involves and presupposes religious liberalism. The premise of both is the substitution of the sovereignty of man in the person of the state for the sovereignty of God. Political and religious liberalism both deny God's decree to establish man's decree via the state. Marxism to a degree, and especially pragmatism, Fabianism and neo-orthodoxy are forms of existentialism. Van Til has called attention in his analysis of James Dan's thinking to the difference between biblical thinking and existentialism. Quote, Reformed theology thinks of Scripture as a directly discernible expression of the will of God for man. Modern existentialism, on the other hand, is based on the idea that human experience makes its norms and ideas as it moves. For it, quote, to exist, end quote, involves knowing nothing in the way of absolute truth, end quote. James Dan, in attacking Van Til in A Theology of Grace, specifically attacked him for, quote, making God's eternal decrees his point of departure, end quote. Dan continues to establish an existentialist foundation for his theology. In Van Til's summary, quote, Dan assumes with Kierkegaard that finite existence is a concept that must be defined independently of God. It cannot be defined in terms of the plan of God, end quote. It is not surprising, in view of Dan's position, that the Reformed Journal and the movement both Dan and the Journal represent should be hostile to constitutional conservatism and very congenial to the Fabian establishment in Washington, D.C., politically and theologically. It represents a transition from faith in God's eternal decree to the decree of the scientific planners. Existentialism, however, does not stand still. Like pregnancy, it moves ahead towards its logical conclusion. Van Til has pointed out that human experience is normative for existentialism. Von Fersen has said of existential philosophy that it, quote, determines the worth of knowledge not in relation to truth, but according to its biological value contained in the pure data of consciousness when unaffected by emotions, volitions, and social prejudice. Both the source and the elements of knowledge are sensations as they, quote-unquote, exist in our consciousness. There is no difference between the external and internal world, as there is no natural phenomenon which could not be examined psychologically. It all has its existence in states of the mind. It is strictly non-metaphysical and anti-hypothetical and contends to give only a simple description of existent psychological realities, end quote. Existentialism is thus a philosophy which denies any ideas of ultimate truth when it is consistently held. For existentialism, knowledge has no relationship to truth. An idea is knowledge, not because it is true, but when it is useful in terms of our biological demands, or to use von Fersen's phrase, it is a valid knowledge, quote, according to its biological value contained in the pure data of consciousness when unaffected by emotions, volitions, and social prejudices, end quote. In other words, the only criterion of any idea of knowledge is how it affects us when we think purely as animals without any religious, moral, or social prejudices. Nihilists and beatniks are thus consistent existentialists. Fabianism, like pragmatism and Marxism, thus approaches society with this framework of reference. Accordingly, the first premise of Fabian, pragmatist, and Marxist policies is that there is no truth, only expediency. There is no evil involved in a political program, only success or failure in terms of the socialist purpose. Man's control of man and the universe, man's own decree as ultimate law. Truth, therefore, is what works, and a lie may be the best truth in operation. Second, there is no law beyond the state, no ultimate truth in the universe. The state therefore cannot err because there is no law in terms of which the state can be judged except itself. The state is thus in error only when it deems it. Stalin erred only when Khrushchev said he did. Similarly, Khrushchev erred only when his successors said that he did. There is no appeal against the existential moment. Every social order that becomes existentialist progressively denies and ultimately destroys all possibility of appeal against the moment, because the uninvolved biology of the moment is its own truth. Neo-orthodoxy operates with a similar framework of reference. First, it has implicitly or explicitly no truth, no word, outside of man. Neo-orthodoxy uses the biblical word as the symbol or sign for the totally human word. It negates the historicity of the Bible by insisting that the Bible is a dialectical rather than a theistic book. Thus, Niebuhr holds, quote, "In reinterpreting the New Testament idea of the parousia, and, as we shall see later, all other ideas dealing with the relation of history and superhistory, such as resurrection and judgment, it is important to take biblical symbols seriously, but not literally. If they are taken literally, the biblical conception of a dialectical relation between history and superhistory is imperiled. For in that case, the fulfillment of history becomes merely another kind of time history. If the symbols are not taken seriously, the biblical dialectic is destroyed, because in that case concepts of an eternity are connoted in which history is destroyed and not fulfilled." End quote. Thus, for Niebuhr, there is no infallible word nor any possibility of it, because there is no sovereign and triune God whose infallible and eternal decree governs all creation, and who therefore can speak authoritatively and finally on all subjects. An infallible scripture requires and presupposes an eternal decree, because only a God who totally governs all history can speak without error concerning it. For Niebuhr, there is thus no authoritative word, no real truth about history. Hence, Niebuhr is a strong advocate of tolerance of all kinds of ideas and theologies, because no authoritative word or final truth has been spoken whereby men and ideas can be judged. Thus, life becomes basically meaningless in itself. Niebuhr has tried to avoid the existentialist conclusion that life is an absolute absurdity by stating, quote, "The final truth about life is always an absurdity, but it cannot be an absolute absurdity. It is an absurdity insofar as it must transcend the system of meaning which the human mind always prematurely constructs with itself at the centre." End quote. Howard has noted of Niebuhr, quote, "Careful scrutiny reveals that Niebuhr's final authority for his theological affirmation is frequently nothing more than the subjective feelings of the believer. Thus, in a much more complex manner than William James, his theology reduces itself to James's pragmatism. If faith makes one feel better, it is true for that person." End quote. Niebuhr's one area of bitter intolerance is for those who hold to the infallible word. This, for him, is the great sin of pride. Since he admits no infallible word, to hold to one is profession of pride, not of faith. For Niebuhr, there is also no law beyond man in this essentially absurd universe. According to him, the state is the source of law and of the inescapable decree. He is thus, in Howard's phrase, an apostle of power, of statist power. Niebuhr, well aware of the pitfalls of his position, has tried to make his view of political power a cynical one. He has written on the illusion of world government, but he is still an advocate of the United Nations and of socialism. Short of suicide, he has nowhere else to go. Either man accepts the sovereign God and his eternal decree, or man will establish in history his own sovereign authority and decree. In Niebuhr's system, the state is viewed cynically, but there is no law or appeal beyond the state. In such perspectives, ultimacy is given to the state, and the only morality for the state is the successful use of power. For individuals, the new morality of existentialism and of all modern schools of thought is simply freedom from God's law. Mellon's principle is that, quote, "Freedom is obedience to self-formulated rules," end quote, and he urges us to write our, quote, "own 10 Commandments," end quote. In Mellon's own formulation of, quote, "a modern man's 10 Commandments," end quote, there is no law, only self-fulfillment. The ostensible morality of this post-Kantian world is love. There is no moral law in personal matters for this tradition other than love, but love, in any historic and realistic sense, is a strong devotion and adherence to someone or something, together with a separation in terms of that love and an aversion to or hatred for its opposite. Love is thus linked with hate. Such love is despised by these post-Kantians. With respect to mother love, Edith Durham has called it the love fraud and advocates the placing of babies in group situations and nurseries after the pattern of Russia, Israel and Sweden. Quote-unquote love in the quote-unquote new morality is simply the total tolerance of all evil. A prominent leader in this school of thought was the humanist Albert Schweitzer, whose only moral principle was reverence for life, which meant the total acceptance of all life, irrespective of moral and religious principles. Schweitzer, in effect, demanded the toleration of all evil, which means also the total intolerance of all righteousness, because righteousness is intolerant and it seeks to redeem a fallen world and eradicate the consequences of sin. This quote-unquote morality is the age-old standard of occultism and of various subversive groups. It was the creed of the self-styled beast, Aleister Crowley, whose doctrine, by no means original with him, was, quote, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole law. Love is the law," end quote. The conclusion of all these post-Kantian systems is the exaltation of the state and the supplanting of God's eternal decree with the totalitarian decree of the state. To restore liberty to the world of man and to history, it is necessary to restore the doctrine of the eternal decree of the sovereign and triune God. Far from destroying man's liberty, the doctrine of predestination is the only valid foundation for it. In the words of the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 3, section 1, quote, "God, from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established." End quote. Upon this foundation, the liberty of Christendom has been established. It cannot exist on any other premise.